Yes, good morning. Good morning. Kazu, thank you for being with us so late at night in your time zone. So happy to see those of you joining us on Zoom, and our CASA students are all going to be filtering in and joining into the conversation soon, but we figured we would get started. Can you all hear me okay? I'm sort of mic'd and I know it's a little hard to hear. Thank you. So Kazu, we are so thrilled and honored to have you here. We have been reading your book and discussing the concepts in your book. And, you know, really in all the work we've been doing the whole semester, I feel like your book synthesizes all the ways that talking about embodied social justice, a trauma-informed approach, has been a lot of what we're talking about with students. Here in the CASA class, students are all in community doing community work. So it's all experiential. And so what's been really great is that they're out in the field and then like coming back into class and reflecting on how am I engaging? What are the strategies for engagement? So as you can hear, they're all coming in. So we're so happy to have you. I think instead of me introducing you, Kazu, I'd love for you to maybe start by telling us a little bit about yourself, what brought you to this work, and also what inspired you to write this book at such a timely place. And, you know, as we said to you before, we will structure this as a Q&A. So folks that are on Zoom, I'll try to pay attention to the chat, but feel free to hit the raise hand icon if you have questions and want to speak. And I'm gonna have this facing the class, Kazu, so you can also see everybody else who is here. So welcome, Kazu.
Cool. Thank you all so much for having me.
I think.
Oh, am I frozen? Can you hear me?
No, you're good now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think you all probably heard that I'm actually zooming in from Taiwan, where it's getting a little late. So I'm okay. I'm like by nature a night person, so I am awake. But if you see me yawning, that's why. But really grateful to be here and really humble that you all are not only having me here, but going through my book. And you know, it's funny since writing the book when I'm asked like about my story and how I ended up here, I'm kind of like, oh, I just gave away all my stories. I don't know what else to say. But I will share that, you know, if you read the book, you know that like my introduction to all of this work happened when I was 17, when I joined this thing called the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage. And I think in a lot of ways that was like it was a deeply spiritual practice, right? It was a project that was initiated by Buddhist monastics, and then I ended up living a year in Buddhist monastery. And so even though there was a clear political and it was with a Buddhist order that was really dedicated to social change work, there was still a spiritual, it was a monastery. And so, you know, I spent my first year and a half in that world. And then when I came back, depending on how old you all are, you may remember that like in the late 1990s, if you were involved in any sort of like social activism, it was a time where like any conversation about spirituality or healing or anything like that was like incredibly taboo. Like people would look at you like you're some crazy hippie from California or something. And like people weren't even singing songs. Like the freedom songs from the civil rights movement had just complete like that sort of song culture had completely dissipated from movement spaces. And so as someone who came into movement spaces from a spiritual tradition, I oftentimes found myself a little bit lost and oftentimes felt like I went over here for my activism and then I went over here for my spiritual practices. And it's really been awesome to see over the last several years, those two worlds coming together more and more. And even like song culture making a big resurgence in movement spaces where movements are singing songs again. And I think as part of that, there is much more awareness around the need for healing. So I think the work that I'm really interested in now is like at that intersection of personal healing and trauma healing work and social activism and spirit, and like where all of those three things meet is where I'm really juiced, and it's kind of like the cutting edge areas of the work that I want to be doing right now. So I'm hearing that it's a little choppy. I'm wondering if, yeah, the internet, it's usually fine at this hour. Let me try to shut down some other programs on my computer. Sometimes that helps. But yeah, why don't I pause there while I. Oh, it's good for you. Okay.
So I think you're okay. I think maybe
Okay.
it was the CASA Pitzer one that's choppy. I think you're coming in all right.
Okay, cool. So yeah, yeah, not sure where you all want to take this conversation. If folks have thoughts, reflections, comments, questions, or.
All right, we were just also trying on our end to see if we could do something to make it a little bit less choppy. So students just came in. Thank you for that introduction. It sounds like some folks are hearing it clearly, and some of the technical stuff might be actually on our end, because it sounds like the people listening on the Zoom are getting it clear. Yeah, clear. Yeah. So, you know, one of the things that I heard you say, Kazu, was, you know, this idea that, you know, bringing in spirituality and activism was not something that necessarily at the time that you were doing the work that you were doing, it was considered crazy California. We're here in California. Thank you very much. And also, you know, reflecting back that oftentimes the brand of spirituality that emerged in more privileged communities was a form of bypass, right? So that, you know, privileged folks saying, oh, everything happens for a reason, or we're all one in their bubble of privilege is dangerous, right? And upholds these toxic structures that we're all trying to change. And so much of what you're talking about is taking that full circle and bringing back spirituality as a radical act, not as a form of bypass, and not as a way to deny suffering, but as something to help us hold the suffering.
Yeah, for sure.
And it, yeah. And, you know, have you gotten pushback for the book? And if and when you do, how do you deal with that?
I rarely get pushback from the book. I mean, I've gotten a lot of pushback in my life, in my career, if you so-called, just because, you know, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about what nonviolence is. Particularly, I live in Oakland, California now. I'm in Taiwan now, but I've been in Oakland for 16 years. And, you know, like when I was really active around the Occupy Oakland movement, and when I was really active around the movement for justice for Oscar Grant, like these spaces, particularly given Oakland's history, a lot of people hear the word nonviolence and they see it as a dirty word, right? Because there's so much misunderstanding about it, and the word nonviolence has been used by people. It's been co-opted and used to try to like pacify movements. And you know, all the things that people say about like, oh, the protesters need to learn how to be peaceful and they need to do this nonviolently, is a euphemism of saying you need to stop protesting and you need to stay quiet. And so I get a lot of pushback in that regard, but I think at the end of the day, I understand that so much of it is just based on the fact that the legacy of nonviolence has been so co-opted, and that it's an opportunity to engage with folks about what the values are that we want to be is serving as the foundation for the work that we're doing. So it's fun. I you know, I love being able to get into challenging conversations about nonviolence and all that. So yeah, it's fun for me.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great. Well, do folks and students, I know the students did not get my emails reminding them that things are early, so they just sort of wandered in right to our conversation. But do you all have any questions? I'm going to try to face the camera so you can see the folks that are here, and we've got the folks online. And do you all have any questions? We have the mic here. You can pass it from the readings for Kazu.
thank you all for adjusting the time for me too. It's a little easier for me.
Of course. Anybody have a question or anything? Yes, can you pass the mic? Oh, let's make sure is that on? Okay, can you hear me? Hello? Yes, we hear you. Oh, okay. Thank you so much for being here. When you were just talking about nonviolent as a dirty word, that really struck a chord with me because as I was reading your book, it was really making me angry. And I couldn't figure out because I understood what you were saying and it resonated with me and I liked it, but I was still feeling like such anger inside of me. And I think that it stems from the word phrase being co-opted and being a dirty word now that we're not supposed to talk about. So I'm glad that you said that because it's been bothering me for a few days. Like, why is this book making me so angry? And I really liked how you talked about power mapping. That was brilliant.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you might be interested to know that I'm currently working on my second book. And the title of the second book is called Fierce Vulnerability. And the term fierce vulnerability comes out of this conversation that my friend Chris and I were having for years about the word nonviolence. And we're talking about how the word nonviolence has become so co-opted and so dirty that we just need to stop using the word altogether. We need to find a different word. And once people like come into the door, then we can start talking about what we mean. But we should stop advertising our workshops as nonviolence workshops and stop talking about our organization as a nonviolence organization. You know, particularly when working in a lot of like marginalized communities, because of the way that marginalized communities have been even further marginalized by being told that they have to learn to be nonviolent. It was really complicated. And so, you know, at some point, this term fierce vulnerability entered our lexicon. We're like, oh, maybe that can be a replacement. And ultimately, after years and years of debate, we did decide that the word nonviolence, it ties us to an important lineage and legacy, and we don't want to lose that connection. And so we're going to double down on the work of really talking about what we mean when we talk about nonviolence and reminding people that the legacy of nonviolence actually comes from communities of color and it comes from resistance work, right? And revolutionary work. And then this whole thing about fierce vulnerability kind of like took on a life of its own and became its own thing. But yeah, for many, many years, we were like, we just have to stop using this word nonviolence. So I'm with you.
Yeah, it wasn't until the end of the last chapter of the book where I started to feel like, oh, I mean, I understood what you were saying and I actually really enjoyed the book, but I think that in the very end, I started to make those connections but I couldn't figure out why I was so angry. So, but thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or reactions you want to share to the book? And just bring it close to your.
Hi, thank you for your time. And I wanted to ask, you talk about disrupting negative peace. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that more?
Yeah. Negative peace is incredibly pervasive throughout our entire culture. I think at the personal level, I think in my book, I talk about how like it's incredibly pervasive in my family. I'm Japanese and I come from a culture where like culturally, we just don't have the ability to talk about really difficult issues. Like if you go to Japan, it's a country that there's so many issues around homelessness and domestic violence and alcoholism and like really harsh racism against Chinese and Korean communities, indigenous communities. And there's this feeling that like talking about any of those issues is like it's uncomfortable, and talking about them would disturb the quiet that we've been able to create in our culture. And so we'd rather just not do it because we value peace and we want harmony. And so it's just easier not to talk about it. And I always talk about how peace in reality, like when in a society where violence is the norm, like peace is an incredibly messy process. And so much of the work of nonviolence is about learning how to be uncomfortable in that mess. In my own kind of journey of understanding what it means to embody nonviolence in my own personal life, like I come from Japan. I come from a very conflict diverse culture. I've had to, and I still am learning. I still struggle with learning to like name tension when I'm feeling something in my body, and to bring it up with my partner, or to bring it up to my colleague. I don't think I talked about it in my book, but like the world of nonviolence is filled with like really nice people. And ironically, a lot of nonviolent practitioners are all very conflict averse. And so in our organization, we have a practice where every other week during our staff meetings, we have what's called a attention check, where we actually create, a good 45 minutes or so on our agenda, where we have to name a tension that we've had with each other over the last couple of weeks, as a way to begin to get comfortable naming things that are bothering us, and learning how to engage in conflict, even if it's a little uncomfortable. And I think by doing that, we're kind of building our muscles and building our capacity to engage in conflict in healthier ways. And I think ultimately the work of social change is about learning how to have really difficult, uncomfortable conversations with society. Right. A lot of what I'm exploring in the second book that I'm working on is kind of like making the connection between my own personal path of healing, where I've had to learn to have conversations with my family about the things that I least wanted to talk to them about, right? Like childhood traumas that I experienced 25 years ago that I'd rather just leave behind 25 years ago. But I came to understand that if I want to have the deepest, most intimate relationships possible with my family, then I have to go all the way back and talk about my early childhood traumas. And that was it was 8 years of my own personal healing journey to build up the capacity and the courage to have those conversations with them. And I think that's what we're trying to do in this country, is to like go back and have a conversation about this nation's childhood trauma, like the enslavement of African peoples, the genocide of indigenous peoples. Those were like the early childhood traumas of this country. And building beloved community in this country means having to go all the way back and having to unpack and have those discussions. And that's going to be really messy. And it's easier to like have negative peace, and it's easier to say, oh, slavery, it happened, hundreds of years ago, it's over, Black people are free now, Barack Obama, yay. And nonviolence is about disturbing that narrative and saying, actually, we're not living in this post-racial world. There are issues that happened 500 years ago that we need to address, that we need to unpack, in order to heal from that collective trauma. So yeah, in our personal lives, in society at large, I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to kind of disturb that complacency, that negative piece.
Thank you. And I see a hand up. I just wanted to reflect back to Kazu. What I think is so powerful is that you're asking your team to put it into practice, right? We're not just developing these philosophies. And I'm having this interesting learning right now, as I'm addressing some mental health issues that my child is going through, where we're working with these cognitive behavioral therapists, and I'm a somatic therapist. My orientation is so different. But what they've been reminding me of is that like the pathways, like our addiction pathways, like we can get addicted to pleasure, and we can also get addicted to avoiding pain. And I feel like what you're describing in our movements is, for some of us, this addiction to avoiding pain, such that we actually don't have the neural pathways to being in discomfort and not being in conflict. And so you are actually implementing a behavior strategy to build the brain of your team and yourself, right? That how do we build these behaviors that move us towards discomfort, but with a different reaction? So I thought that was really, it's so beautiful to see it in action and just think about how we change our brains, right? And so much of the conversation in your book and in this class has been about building our own internal capacity, our own resilience, our own capacity to be with discomfort. And how do we do that with each other? Somebody in the chat said, have things remained uncomfortable or taken more time than expected to resolve during these tension checks? If so, what do you do? How do you navigate or lead your team in the middle of discomfort?
Yeah, so in nonviolence, we teach that the more escalated a conflict is, the more we have to escalate our nonviolent response to that conflict. So oftentimes during these tension checks, like because we do them on a regular basis, they never get that escalated, right? That's part of the idea, is that the more we talk about conflicts, the less they build up and the less escalated that it gets. But as we know, like we all have unhealed trauma, and oftentimes even when there's like a small minor conflict with like person A, it actually triggers like a 30-year-old memory, and we're not always aware that that's what's happening. And so we bring that 30 years of pain into that conflict, and then it escalates. And so when these tension checks escalate, we have to use different strategies, right? Like the tension checks are usually like 45 minutes before we jump into the business agenda of the meeting. But if we see that a tension is actually escalating, we might need to schedule some other time and build a stronger container where we can really dive into that, or look at our agenda and say, you know what, this relationship right now is more important than the things that we have on our agenda today. And so, we're a small nonprofit. We have a lot of work all the time. And yet we still oftentimes take 2 hours in at the beginning of our staff meeting to deal with these issues, to make sure that we can kind of be in a good place as we're going about doing our work. So yeah, I mean, we have really trusting relationships. We do a lot of relational work. So I don't think there's anything that's ever been surfaced where it still lingers. We really do try to emphasize making sure that we can come back to a place of reconciliation before we move forward. But I personally have relationships that have not been reconciled in my life. Healing takes its own time, and you can't force it on other people. You can't force reconciliation on other people if they're not ready for it, if we're not ready for it, if the time isn't right. And sometimes, it's a hard thing that I've had to accept, to know that sometimes the most skillful step I can take towards reconciliation is to take a little bit of space. Sometimes that's the best thing for myself to do, and sometimes it's what the other person needs. But the path towards reconciliation looks like many different things, and sometimes it means space. So
thank you. And students here, if it's hard to hear, if you pull it up on the computer, you could read the transcripts. You might want to do that. Kathy, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Kazu, for being here. It means a lot. And thank you for organizing this space, Hala and Tessa. So I have so much to ask, but I think I'm only going to ask 2 short questions, if that's okay. I am gifted with facilitating a class called The Social Theory of Thich Nhat Hanh. And we are so happy that you're here, because we did some of your reading and then we compared it and contrasted it with Thich Nhat Hanh. So the first question is beloved community versus Sangha, similarities and differences. And then the second question is more about direct action and praxis. So as you probably know, Pomona Fairplex is within 5 miles of our campus. We're a predominantly white campus. There's a lot of class sort of dialogues and non-dialogues. And there's anywhere from 600 to 1,000 migrant children currently detained in Pomona Fairplex. It's going to close shortly. There's a history of Japanese American incarceration there. So we want to do some kind of walking mindfulness to not only honor, but to also recognize and connect with Indigenous communities. I recognize that you had a beautiful walking mindfulness practice in relation to Karina Gold instead of reparation. And so I want to get at where PWI, we want to honor space and time and memory, and we're looking forward to a new Asian American Studies class where I incorporate that. So any ideas or thoughts that you have, I would love. So those are the two short, not short questions. Thank you.
Yeah, well, first I'll just say that Thich Nhat Hanh's Living Buddha, Living Christ was the first book I ever read on peacemaking or on Buddhism back when I was like 16 or something. And I'm doing some work with the Order of Interbeing to infuse some direct action stuff in the Sangha too. So yeah, lots of connections there. But I mean, I think there's both similarities and differences between the idea of a Sangha or a spiritual community and beloved community. I think, you know, I've gone to a couple of retreats at Deer Park Monastery, and every time I go to a monastery within that lineage, I feel such a deep sense of belonging. And I think at the end of the day, beloved community, like we've been talking about our work at East Point as a place where like we're trying to build a movement culture where no single individual will ever even think to question their sense of belonging in beloved community. Because as Thich Nhat Hanh teaches, like belonging and interdependence, interbeing, as he calls it, is just a universal fact of reality. And so, you know, I oftentimes talk about it like in the same sense of like gravity. I'm fascinated by this reality that there's this like new movement of flat earthers in the world. Like there are people who believe that the earth is flat and that gravity isn't real. Even if you don't believe that gravity is real, you're still governed by its laws because it's just a fact of nature, right? And similarly, I believe that belonging and interbeing is just a universal fact of nature. We belong to each other, but sometimes we develop this delusion that we don't belong, that we are somehow isolated, and that we're somehow separate. And I think that that idea of separation and isolation is at the core of a lot of trauma, right? And so I think communities that remind people of our belonging to each other, like Thai Sanghas and like many of our movement spaces, I think reminds us of the truth that we are all part of beloved community. And the one thing that I'll say is different though, and I wrote this in my book too, is that a lot of people do think of beloved community and they're like, oh, my Sangha, my church, my school, my housemates, these are my beloved communities. And I always want to remind people that for Dr. King and for Josiah Royce, who's the theologian who created the term beloved community, building beloved community was not about loving the people that are easy to love, right? It's about like, okay, here are the people in my community, my loving community, the people that I hang out with. Building the work of beloved community is doing my own healing work enough that I can understand that my community goes way beyond that to the people that I don't like and to the people that I disagree with and the people that I don't look like me and that voted for somebody else. And right, I think once we can do the work of cultivating empathy and compassion for all of those people, then that's the work of building beloved community, and it's a real struggle. And as far as I think you were asking about like ideas for direct action. Is that? You know, I'm currently really inspired by this like budding relationship I have with this organization called Tsuru for Solidarity. And it's a group of Japanese and Japanese Americans doing direct action work, largely around immigration issues and detention issues. And I think because it's a Japanese American organization that has a deep connection with its own kind of experience with internment and things like that, like they understand the need for healing and they understand the need to bring in their own cultural elements to address that. And so I think, because I didn't hear everything you said, but you mentioned that it's part of like an API group that you're working with. Yes, I think the more we can bring like cultural elements into direct action, the more it can begin to look like healing. In the Fierce Vulnerability book, one of like the $1 million questions that I'm exploring is if we viewed nonviolent direct action as a modality of collective trauma healing, what could it look like? And when we think of trauma healing modalities, there's so, like, every culture has its own ways of addressing and holding space for healing trauma. And I think the more we can bring those practices directly into direct action spaces, the more we can kind of meet this paradox of like needing to have the power and the assertiveness to stop injustice and to make systemic change, while also giving us the kind of vulnerability to bring about healing. So it's just some random thoughts.
That's not so random, so beautiful. And I just jumped right in because I've been practicing Qigong with Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. And a part of it is opening up that or remembering that window of our own practices, and then also Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, who is working alongside immigration detention and the carceral state, is then what movement practices do they have for those who are impacted by the immigration carceral state? And it's been really remarkable to see the ways in which different modalities of our different social locations are meeting each other and departing, but that common anchor of remembering, and that's in many different ways, of coming back to our body, but also remembering who we are in our humanity and each other. So thank you for that. Thank you.
That's awesome. The Buddhist Peace Fellowship has experimented with things like meditation blockades, like actually blockading things while sitting in meditation and things like that. And I think there's a lot of power when we can bring in our like healing modalities into resistance spaces.
Okay, try that again.
I have another question, if that's okay. Do you think the concept and practice of beloved community needs to be approached differently from groups who are in a dominant community or oppressed community?
Can you say a little bit more? What do you mean?
Individuals from different communities with different amounts of power in society approach the concept of beloved community. Do you think that approach needs to be different, and what role does your positionality play in the way that you interact with the theory?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think yes and no. I think there's a way in which it's all the same work, because like if beloved community, if interdependence, if the reality that we belong to each other is a universal law of nature, then no matter what perspective or experience you come at it from, like, it's like gravity is gravity, right? We're all trying to get to that same place. And it's also different because, you know, like I think someone mentioned earlier, like in the context of race, a lot of white identified folks lean into that, like, oh, we're all one race, right? And that's actually not what beloved community is trying to say. Like beloved community and diversity is not all of us being the same. Like it's not about us becoming like a puree, right? It's about us like honoring the fact that we are different and that we have different experiences, and therefore the work that we need to do to come back to oneness does look very different. I think like a lot, you know, some of the work that I'm really interested in these days, I've gotten into the work of reparations a lot more. And as a first generation Japanese immigrant, I realized that a lot of the work that I need to do to come back to like the wholeness of my own self and like to build beloved community even in my own body is to learn to love the fact that I come from a lineage of colonizers. Like my people colonized so many parts of Asia and of course all of Japan. My people are not indigenous to Japan. And so like the work of building beloved community for me is to actually allow myself to feel in my body the pain that my ancestors perhaps could not feel. I'm kind of like, I'm noticing how sleepy I am. my words aren't flowing as much, but I think I wrote in my book that I'm really convinced that there's this idea in restorative justice circles that hurt people, right? Like when we are feeling hurt, we take that out and hurt other people. But the flip side of that is that hurting people hurts, that when we cause harm on another living being, that somehow damages the wholeness of who we are. And I think we're oftentimes so cut off from our own like wholeness that we're not able to see that and to feel that. Like we ourselves are so traumatized that we can cause harm on other living beings and not even, or think that we're not even feeling it. And so I think, a lot of our ancestors who come from more privileged places, they caused incredible amounts of harm. And because of their own trauma, they weren't able to feel the guilt and the shame and the pain of having caused so much pain and suffering to other people. And I think the work that I need to do as someone who comes from a more privileged group of people, at least in the context of Asia, is I need to like retroactively feel the emotions that my ancestors weren't allowed to feel back then. And even on a personal level, like a lot of the work that I do now, I've realized over many, many years of therapy and healing that like when I was young, I was so deeply lonely. Like I was so lonely and I didn't know how to even notice that I was so lonely. I just like drowned it in isolation, drugs, alcohol, all these different things. So a lot of the work that I need to do now to bring myself back to wholeness is to retroactively feel how lonely I was then, because I couldn't feel it then. And the more I can feel the loneliness that I was actually feeling when I was younger, the more it kind of like releases from my body, right? And so looking at it from like an intergenerational standpoint, I think there's a lot of healing that I need to do that my ancestors couldn't do. And so as people who come from a group of people who caused a lot of harm, I think that's the work that we need to do, right? Is to feel the pain and the guilt and the shame so that I can release that, so that I can love that part of my own lineage as well. So in that sense, that work is very different depending on kind of which side of the harm you come at it with, right?
Well, thank you, Kazu. That was, so beautifully shared. I'm seeing some more hands. I see Noah, who's on the Zoom, who's part of our class. Noah. And then I see Clara as well.
Oh yeah, I just sort of was curious. I remember there's an anecdote in your book around an interaction you had with I think it was not a roommate, but someone in your apartment complex who you sort of had a borderline violent confrontation because I guess as you expressed it, you hadn't necessarily like fully stopped and taken the time to sort of empathize maybe where that person was coming from, and so you're being reactive. And I'm just curious, in situations where things do reach literal violence and sort of a physical altercation, what, where do you come out of that and still have a sort of a healing process? I know, coming from my own experiences, my own background, there was certain environments I was in where that was very much the norm. And it was certainly stressful. But at certain times I found that after that initial interaction, it brought down certain barriers for connection if things were handled in an empathetic way after the fact. And so I'm sort of curious your thoughts on that. And in an imperfect world, how can we handle violence and process that violence in as meaningful and positive a way as possible?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm not naive enough to think that we're ever going to build a world without harm and violence on some level, right? So we do need to learn how to get through that. And one of the stories that I'm writing about in my new book is I have the real privilege to facilitate these things called victim offender dialogues, which are dialogues between incarcerated people and the people that they harmed. And one story in particular that I'm kind of diving deeper into in my book is one of the first ones that I ever facilitated was between a mom and the incarcerated person who murdered her son 20 years prior. And it took about a year of prep on like prepping both sides individually before we brought the two sides together. And when we brought the two sides together, it was probably the most incredible dialogue that I've ever witnessed in my entire life. Like there was this moment where I don't want to go into all the details because it'll take some time, but there was a moment where the mom, her name is Cynthia, she was holding Richard's hands and she was saying, I had a dream last night that I needed to hold these hands because these are the hands that took my son's life away, and I needed to have a different relationship with them. And there was another moment where she was saying that, I remember because Richard, who's the incarcerated man, and Mitch, who's Cynthia's son that he killed, they played baseball together when they were young. And Cynthia said that, I remember when Mitch was young, I would be driving him to baseball practice and I would see you walking to practice every day. And I always felt bad for you because I knew you came from a broken home. And so you didn't have anyone that would bring you to the practices. And so I always I felt for you and I saw you. And Richard broke down in that moment and he was saying like at that point in his life, he was so alone and lonely and he didn't think anyone saw him. And now 20 years later, to hear from the mother of the person whose life he took that she saw him, like healed a pain that he had been carrying for 20 years. And so these kinds of stories just confirm for me our resilience and our like amazingness as human beings and how deeply capable we are of healing even from the most violent acts. And I think that's where, like, I have a spiritual practice, so I don't mind calling it spiritual practice. Some other people might use different words, but I think like it speaks to this like depth of who we are as a species and the resiliency that we're capable of and the healing that we're capable of. It oftentimes takes time, right? That dialogue happened 20 years after the fact. It takes a lot of work on both sides to be able to go back to that incident of harm, the homicide, the taking of a life, and to be able to like really put themselves back into that moment so that they can really unpack what happened and to heal from that. But I think oftentimes when harm happens, it's an opportunity to touch a really deep part of ourselves in a way that we might not otherwise be able to. So there's a way in which like it can be a gift because violence and harm and experiencing that allows us to touch a deeper core of who we are, and therefore a deeper part of our resiliency too. So yeah, there's obviously so much more to that, but just what came up.
Thank you. I love that allows us a deeper access to ourselves. That's so powerful, Kazu. Thank you. Clara, I see your hand up.
Yes. Hi, Kazu. Nice to see you. My question is, well, I've just been thinking a lot about aggression conciliation and the conciliation piece of that with individuals. And my question is, given that we can't like bring or force healing or accountability to people until they're ready, how do we be in community with people that have harmed us or someone else, like in the meantime, without, imprisoning or something like that?
Yeah, my friend Sierra, I think I might have mentioned this in the book too. Like I said, I've like given away all my stories, so I don't know what else to say, but my friend Sierra sometimes says that beloved community is a huge place And someone could be all the way over there in beloved community, but they're still part of beloved community. It doesn't mean I have to invite that person over for dinner, but it means that I have to find a way to honor their dignity as a human being. And if that person is so traumatized themselves that they're in a place where they're going to continue to repeat and cause further harm to other people, then we need to create structures in our own communities to ensure the safety of other people around them, right? But that can, there's a couple of ways that can happen. We can isolate that person and incarcerate them, like we do in our current society, and lock them up and throw away the key. Or we actually have to find ways to provide the spaces necessary for that person to go through their own path of healing, so that they can be welcomed back into the community and not cause harm. It has to be one or the other, right? And certainly a timeout is oftentimes warranted. There are indigenous cultures that deeply believe in restorative practices that have practices of, okay, you need to go for a timeout right now. And while you're in timeout, there's this indigenous nation in the Pacific Northwest that when you cause harm in their village, they have a whole separate island with a cottage, and they send you away to this cottage. But every single week, an elder from that village visits you on that island and checks in on you and see how you're doing and supports you in your journey of healing. So even though they're isolated, they're still in connection. And there's still an understanding that at some point they're going to be welcomed back into community. And so I think even when people cause harm, we have to figure out a way to protect people first, to protect their safety, but also to ensure that that person is still part of beloved community and that they're reminded of, it's oftentimes when they forget that they themselves are members of beloved community that they cause harm. And so we have to double down and remind that person of their responsibility and their commitment to to being part of beloved community. So yeah, I think there's lots of we're smart enough to figure out how we can protect people's safety and remind that person of their belonging.
I love that. It reminds me of a definition of love that I heard at some point, which is love is seeing somebody's humanity, beauty, greatness, even when they can't see it. And I feel like that's really the call, is offering that mirroring to them.
Yeah, and there's somewhat related, there's Prentice Hemphill has a great quote about boundaries. They say that, I think it's something along the lines of boundaries are the distance at which I can love both you and me, right? So sometimes that space is a way to love both of you. And so, I'm not saying that space and sometimes even isolation can't be part of the equation, but it has to be because you acknowledge your belonging to each other.
Absolutely. How about y'all in here? Any other questions or comments? We only have a few more minutes with Kazu. Yes, can you pass the mic over to
I kind of wanted to ask about something you had mentioned before.
you keep it closer to you?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I can mostly hear you.
More about how this concept of healing the childhood trauma that our country holds. And I know you didn't really intend with that comment to lay out a whole practical plan how we go about that. But I'm wondering if you can speak to it all, how reparations, and I know you're saying you've been more into that or reading or studying that maybe, what role reparations might have in that, because I'm wondering how do we have that sort of healing or conflict resolution when it would take decades to happen, of course, and both the people on both sides of it would be cycling through, and because when something takes a long time, over a process like that, it wouldn't be the same. People of African descent in the US are receiving the benefits of that as
beginning of the process, it would be the same people making up for it, or whatever the words might be. Is that making any sense? Sort of.
I didn't hear all of what you said, so let me just try to repeat it back and summarize. There was a question about the role of reparations in healing, especially as it relates to like early traumas and things like that. But there was also something about like the pace, right? That it takes decades, that this kind of work takes decades.
Yeah, because this kind of work, this kind of healing, like would take decades to happen. People on both sides of it, but the side that need to receive some sort of healing, or I mean, I guess maybe you'd say everybody needs to receive some sort of healing, but people on both sides of that issue, like, would be cycling through, you know, it would go over, it would span lifetimes. Like, how does that sort of thing happen, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, I think it is going to take lifetimes, unfortunately, right? But let me start with the question about reparations. I think reparations needs to be part of, and reparations means so much more than money, right? If you haven't looked at the Movement for Black Lives as Reparations Now Toolkit, it's a really amazing resource that really expands our understanding of what it means to be working towards reparations. Obviously, money is a big part of it. But I think reparations has to be a big part of it, because for the person or the side that caused harm, making amends is not something that like we do out of obligation, but it's something that we do because it's part of our own journey to accountability and healing, right? That being able to feel remorse for the pain that I caused is a part of my own healing journey. And so it's not something that I'm even doing for the person that I'm giving reparations to, but it's because I understand that if I don't do it, then I'm not going to be whole. And then for the side that experienced the harm, you know, of course, like the acknowledgement that harm is happening, the cessation of the harm, the stopping of the harm, and then doing whatever can be done to try to repair the harm. Like I think sometimes on the left, people rush too quickly towards reconciliation. And that's like a lot of the bypassing that happens, right? But like justice and accountability has to be, it's a prerequisite to reconciliation. And so I think that has to be part of it. And the thing about it taking decades and lifetimes, I think it's a little bit of a paradox again. On the one hand, I want to say that I think taking radical forms of direct action is a way to like jumpstart change and create possibilities that might not be available otherwise, right? Like I really do believe in this kind of multiple millennia like journey that we're on as a species, that we are moving closer and closer to collective liberation. Like if you look at social media feeds, it might not look like it, but I do believe that we're moving in that direction. So even if the US civil rights movement hadn't happened, I do believe that ultimately we would have gotten some of those victories. I think because those Black leaders during the 1960s weren't afraid to put their bodies on the line and risk bodily harm and use like radical forms of direct action to like create that kind of discomfort, it jump-started and it caused a lot, it created opportunities for more healing to happen quicker than it would have otherwise happened. And so I think the more we can engage in radical forms of direct action that are healing, the faster we can kind of like, it's almost like a time machine, right? It gives us like a boost. And like on the other side of that paradox, yeah, like this is lifetimes of work and there's no way around that. And I think because it's lifetimes of work and because there's going to be people cycling in and out of it from different places of their own healing, I think that's why this kind of work has to happen systematically. Like, it's great that there's more and more spaces for individual people to engage in trauma healing practices and go to meditation retreats and like there's more and more access around that. But if it doesn't happen systemically, like if as a society as a whole, if we're not looking at how are we providing opportunities for trauma healing at scale, then we're always going to be kind of like circling around and around and around, right? And so I really believe strongly that like everything we know about trauma healing at the personal level and at the like the small scales, we need to figure out how to bring it to scale. And most likely we will need to engage in radical acts of nonviolent direct action to actually bring it to scale.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I have so many thoughts about that, but I see that Rob has his hand up. Rob.
Yeah, hi. I just want to start off by saying thank you so much for being here. And just I really enjoyed your book. I feel like I was like highlighting almost every single sentence.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I think I struggled with was your part on individual and collective healing. And you say how our own healing is never dependent on anyone else. But then at the same time, because we're harmed in relationships, we need to heal in relationships. And to me, those two things feel mutually exclusive. And I just want to hear what you have to say, because I'm trying to understand how those two things can coexist.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of my early childhood trauma is the result of having had a very abusive stepfather in our home for many, many years. I haven't seen him since I was 16 or something. At some point, like I have this fantasy in my head, I would love to like have this like amazing healing reconciliatory dialogue with him, right? And that's not accessible to me right now. Where I have found healing in that relationship, or some of the ways in which I found that healing, is when I've been able to talk about that experience with other people in my community. A lot of what I experienced in my early childhood for 20 years, I had so much shame around that I never talked about it to anybody. And there's this beautiful quote that says, shame derives its power from being unspoken. So the more you don't speak about the things you're most ashamed of, the more power it has over you, right? So it was like running my life for 20 years. I didn't even realize that's what was happening. And when I learned to share about those experiences in relationship, in community, and for my body to begin to understand that I can talk about things that I'm ashamed of within people that I trust, that I'm in relationship with, and it's actually going to deepen my relationship with them. Because I think some part of me always thought that if I shared the things that I'm most ashamed of, I'm going to be ostracized. I'm going to be outcast. I'm going to be isolated. So that's one of the reasons why we don't talk about shame, right? But realizing that in relationship, in safe containers, if I speak about those things, it's actually going to deepen my sense of belonging and beloved community. Like that was one of the most liberating things. And so I think a lot of the work that I do now is about creating those spaces where people feel safe enough to speak about the things that they're most ashamed of. And it may not be with the person that actually caused the harm, but it's still this sense of, oh, I can show up with all of myself, with all of my brokenness, with all of my loneliness, with all of my messiness, and I'm going to belong on the other end of it. It's incredibly liberating. And so I think, yeah, obviously, like I still want to have that conversation with my old stepfather, but I also know that I don't need that because I've already been seen in my shame and in all of that pain that I experienced as a child in other relationships, you know?
Thank you so much for that answer.
Thank you, Kazu, and I know we want to liberate you so you could. And I just wanted to, just by way of closing, that so much of the message that you're sharing with us is really about this wholeness. And as I was crafting my questions for you, it was really about, what is our biggest barrier towards understanding the other, right? You talk in the book that trying to understand someone's point of view doesn't mean you agree. And I was reflecting on, I think that what scares us, and maybe I'll speak for myself the most, is the fear that the other is me, right? That this, that I have the possibility of being that, and that if I let myself get close to their pain, I have to touch into that pain inside of me. And it feels like so much of your message is that the more whole we are, and the more we're able to be whole with each other, that's going to radically transform our communities, and that is beloved community. So thank you so much. I know we could sit and talk to you for so much more time, but thank you for making the time to speak with us, and thank you for writing this amazing book. I can't wait for your next book. And please be well and take care of yourself. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thanks for being part of this class. And Hala, I was actually browsing through a website today that of people doing some really awesome work in the yoga community. I saw your name on there too, so I was like, oh, it's awesome. So thank you for the work that you all are doing as well.
Of course, thank you. We'll stay in touch, friend.
Sounds good. Take care.
Bye.